All right, so The Guardian recently published an article on race and IQ. This is the, I think, second article they've published on race and IQ in the last couple months. This one is entitled Why Genetic IQ Differences Between Races Are Unlikely. It's by Kevin Mitchell, an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin. So Mitchell writes that most of our traits, such as height, for example, are set by natural selection at an optimal level. It's good for humans to be about so tall on average. Some genetic variants tend to make people a bit shorter than average, and some tend to make people a bit taller. The balance between these variants has been maintained by natural selection to keep average height just right. Intelligence is not like that, though. Unlike height, where being even taller had no benefit, strong evolutionary forces drove intelligence in one direction only in our ancient ancestors. He goes on, this increasing selective advantage of ever greater intelligence led to a snowball effect, which was probably only stopped by the limitations of the size of the birth canal and the metabolic demands of a large brain. Now, a lot could be said about this, but one thing to say is that there's no reason to assume that limitations in terms of metabolic demands of a large brain are going to be equal across racial groups, right? Because some groups are going to have easier access to calories than others, and so therefore they can afford an organ which consumes more calories. The same is true in terms of limitations stemming from the size of a birth canal. So from the paper, Brain Size, IQ, and Racial Group Differences Evidence from Musculoskeletal Traits, we see that white women average a birth canal of 27.4 centimeters wide, whereas black women average a birth canal on average of 24.6 centimeters wide. This paper actually looks at a total of 37 traits that display racial differences in the way you would expect correspond to the differences in brain size and IQ, and which are related to the evolution of brain size in other animals. Another example is knee joint angle. East Asians average a wider knee joint angle than do whites, who average a wider knee joint angle than do blacks. And this is, in the animal kingdom, associated with larger brains because this provides a more stable platform for the more curved thigh bones, which result from a wider pelvis. Now, Mitchell goes on, we shouldn't expect intelligence to be affected by a balance of IQ-boosting mutations and IQ-hampering mutations. Instead, genetic differences in intelligence may largely reflect the burden of mutations that drag it down. Now, what he's saying here is that genetic variation in intelligence is mostly due to differences in really rare variants that come across in errors in copying DNA rather than in common variants, where 40% of the population has one variant and 60% has the other. There's good reason to think that a lot of genetic variation in intelligence, contrary to what Mitchell writes, is actually due to variation in common variants. And this has to do with a technique called genome-wide complex trait analysis. Or these days you just talk about SNP chip heritability estimates. And what's involved here is a process by which behavioral geneticists estimate the proportion of variants or differences in the trait which are attributable to genes, the heritability of a trait that is. They estimate that heritability by looking at the degree to which genetic similarity in unrelated individuals predicts phenotypic similarity in the observable trait, in this case IQ. Now, what's important to understand is that with the SNP chip, this is the sort of technology used here, and SNP is a SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. This is a kind of gene variant that involves a single base pair difference between people. So when you measure these SNPs, what's going on is not that you look at that place in the genome, and in fact all over the genome, and look for random rare mutations or anything that could be there. Instead, in order to sort of economically optimize the efficiency of the process, what goes on is that there are a set of gene variants that are common in the population, that we know that they are highly polymorphic, that is, they differ a lot between individuals. And the SNP chips specifically measure differences in those common variants. If you looked at a wider array of gene variant of genes, the problem would be that a lot of them would not be polymorphic, that is, that they wouldn't vary hardly at all between individuals, and so you'd end up with a lot of redundant measurements just confirming that everyone has the genes that lead to the production of two eyeballs, right? And so the fact that these SNP chips produce heritability estimates that are reasonably high for IQ, ranging around 50%, suggests that most of the genetic variation in IQ is probably attributable to common SNPs. So this is from the blog of a behavioral geneticist back in 2013. And he writes, mutation load selection balance models predicted that it would be impossible to explain any of the variants in IQ using existing chips because these chips were built around high frequency and high tagging efficiency. So mutation load theories have a new hurdle. They must assert that SNPs which are adding into the model are doing so, not because they tag common functional variants, but because they occasionally tag recent rare large effects in small subsets of the total sample. Now, the use of the word tag here, that's just saying basically correlates with. So that the people who are saying that mutational load is what explains genetic variation in IQ are going to have to argue that these common SNPs correlate heavily with these rare mutations, which we would not expect to happen, in order to explain the fact that these common SNPs can predict similarity in IQ. Now we look at another blog, also from 2013, when a lot of this data first started to become undeniable, by another fellow involved in behavioral genetics research, and he writes, one unresolved issue is to what extent mutational load can account for population variance in IQ. The standard argument is that very rare variants will not be well tagged by common SNPs, and hence the heritability results found by GCTA, genome-wide complex trait analysis, suggest that a good chunk of variation is accounted for by common variants, e.g. MAF over 0.05, and MAF is minor allele frequency, which is the frequency of the least common allele. An allele is variant of the gene, so that if the minor allele frequency is over 0.5, it means that there's no version of the gene which is had by fewer than 5% of people. They go on. The counter argument, which I have not yet seen investigated fully, is that relatedness defined over a set of common SNPs is correlated to the similarity in mutational load of a pair of individuals due to complex family history of human populations. Unrelated individuals selected at random from a common ethnic group and religion and region are, on average, roughly as related as third cousins. And so the idea here is that these SNP heritability studies are looking at similarity in common variants. And in order to hold to the mutational load hypothesis that Mitchell is putting forward, what you have to say is that similarity in these common SNPs predicts similarity in rare mutations. And why would that be? Well, rare mutations run in families, especially recessive ones, right? They get unexpressed, they can run in families for very long times. And even unrelated people that are not in the same family, they're not even cousins, they're further apart than that, still are vaguely related in the way that really extended kin groups are. And so maybe that's what's going on. But a problem here is that in the original complex trait analysis paper, which is the paper that sort of first tested and demonstrated this behavioral genetic technique, it was found that relatedness computed on a set of common genotype SNPs is a poor predictor of relatedness of rare SNPs. The rare SNPs are in poor linkage disequilibrium with the genotype SNPs due to differences in minor allele frequency. And linkage disequilibrium here, for our purposes, again, just means correlated. So the point is that the initial paper that tested this method showed that similarity in common SNPs is not a good predictor of similarity in rare SNPs, suggesting that the fact that common SNP similarity predicts IQ similarity suggests that mutational load is not what's going to account for a very large proportion of the genetic variation in intelligence. This year, some major progress was made on this front. In the paper, Genetic Analysis of Family Data Reveals Additional Genetic Effects on Intelligence and Personality. And what was done here basically was a method was devised that allowed researchers to look at the IQ similarity that resulted from being in the same family when you controlled for actually living in the same home as a child. And what this allowed them to do is to look at genetics in a way that would definitely capture all of these rare mutational loads that are found in families. And doing this did increase the heritability of intelligence, suggesting that mutational load does play some role in the genetics of intelligence, but it is not going to account for the majority of heritability of intelligence, contrary to the picture that Mitchell was painting. Now, it should be also noted, this is from a paper, 2015 paper by David Piffer, showing that national IQ can be predicted using a polygenic score. A polygenic score is where basically, I think in this instance, he's literally just averaging the frequency of different alleles that are related to intelligence. Now, the important point here isn't just that this is evidence of fact that national IQ differences are caused by genetic differences between national populations, but moreover, that this polygenic score is computed using the frequency of common variants, not rare variants. Now, that 2015 paper was using a polygenic score constructed from 9 gene variants. The science is progressing very quickly. This paper hasn't been published yet, but the preprint for the paper, Evidence for Recent Polygenic Selection on Educational Attainment and Intelligence Inferred from GWAS Hits, a replication of previous findings using recent data, does this again with a larger sample of SNPs that are related to intelligence. And in particular, a correlation of 0.85 is found between a polygenic score constructed from 161 intelligence-related SNPs and population IQ. And again, these SNPs are all common variants. Now, Mitchell says that thousands of variants affect intelligence. They are constantly changing, and they affect other traits. It is not impossible for natural selection to produce populations with differences in intelligence, but these factors make it highly unlikely. To end up with systemic genetic differences in intelligence between large ancient populations, the selective forces driving those differences would need to have been enormous. What's more, the forces would have had to have acted across entire continents with wildly different environments and have been persistent over tens of thousands of years of tremendous cultural change. Such a scenario is not just speculative, I would argue it is inherently and deeply implausible. Now, firstly, let us say that it is true that intelligence, the genotype of intelligence, also impacts lots of other traits. This is more formally said by saying that intelligence has a genetic correlation with a large number of phenotypes. This includes physical phenotypes like height, as well as psychological phenotypes like, say, self-control. This is a well-studied phenomenon, but this does not make it obviously more or less likely that evolution is going to lead to population differences. If anything, actually, I think it would suggest that it would be easier for population differences to emerge, because what this implies is that maybe the selection doesn't even have to be for intelligence. Maybe the selection for height differences between populations is going to lead to a difference in genotypic IQ because of the genetic correlation between height and IQ, for instance. This opens up a whole new world of possibilities of selection scenarios by which populations end up with different IQs. I also want to go into the Breeder's equation. Now, the Breeder's equation tells us R, the response, or the change in a phenotype across one generation in a population, is equal to the selection differential multiplied by the narrow heritability. Now, selection differential is just going to be some measure of the association between fertility and the phenotype in question. The heritability, narrow heritability, is the proportion of variation in a trait due to genes, specifically due to additive genes, but that's not going to really matter here for our purposes. Now, we can use this to see that actually evolution can be remarkably sensitive. So here I have different scenarios where the heritability is either 0.1, 0.5, or 0.9, and the selection differential is either, 0.0001, 0.001, you can see what the options are. And then looking at how large of a phenotypic difference that would lead to if it was just consistent directional selection over 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and 2,000 generations. Now, one way to think about the selection differential in terms of differences between populations is the difference in the correlation between, say, IQ and fertility among Europeans and among Africans. So the difference in those two correlations. And it's easy to imagine that given the environmental differences between those groups in terms of the nutrition that was available, in terms of the climactic variables, in terms of the social cooperation that was necessitated by their conditions. One narrative, and this is just a story, but this is a plausible story. Some people say that, it was colder up north. This required, therefore, more hunting because crops died. And you had to go hunting in larger groups because of some of the differences in the animal life up north. And this required more cooperation, more long-term planning, more storage of food for the winter. And this all required a little more intelligence. Which is to say just that being smart was a little more beneficial than it otherwise would have been. Now, what we can see is that even if you assume a low heritability figure, over the sort of time span that the races have been separated, this could lead to very large differences. And these differences, what is 2? It's 2 standard deviations of difference in particular. Now, the racial difference in intelligence that everyone's talking about is 1 standard deviation. And as we can see on here, very small differences in selection differential over this sort of time span can lead to a standard deviation or way more, even given low heritability figures as well. And so this is conceptually the sort of algebraic approach to this. Now, it is worth noting that IQ today is negatively correlated with intelligence fairly dramatically at the country level. So that at the country level, there's something like a negative 0.75 correlation between mean country IQ and fertility. Now, recently a paper was released, Regional Differences in Intelligence in 22 Countries under Economic, Social, and Demographic Correlates, a review. And what this found, it's looking at the correlation between a region within a country's mean IQ and its fertility level. And what we can see not only is that these correlations are consistently negative, which could concern us in terms of the dysgenic trends that may be taking place, we can also see that they vary a lot. Because in Japan, for instance, the correlation is only negative 0.1, whereas in Turkey, the correlation is negative 0.84. So these are very large differences in some cases in the correlation between fertility and IQ in different places in the world. Given that that's taking place now, that lends plausibility to the view that historically there have been differences in the relationship between IQ and fertility across regions. There's no reason to think that it's written in law somehow that this relationship is going to be the same everywhere, since it's not now. And in fact, if we look even at groups of people that live in the same area, broadly speaking, if we look at blacks and whites in the United States, what you can see here is that the relationship between fertility and IQ disaggregated by race and sex does not look the same in each case. And in particular, black women stand out as having an abnormally steep and linear negative relationship between IQ and fertility. Using something a little more complicated than what I mentioned before, the selection differential was calculated here. And I think it's just worth pointing in passing that given the difference in selection differential between blacks and whites in the United States today, this would produce an IQ gap of 16 points, which is roughly the gap between blacks and whites in America today, in 4,000 years. Now, 4,000 years is a long time for us in terms of things we want to do, but 4,000 years is very little compared to the amount of time that the races have been separated. So the key point here is that in order for it to be true that evolution did not select for differences in intelligence between the groups, what's going to have to be true is that the environmental differences between living in Africa and living in Europe prehistorically and historically have been smaller than the differences between blacks and whites today who live in America. That the environmental difference between being a black or a white American today is larger, right, than the difference between living in Africa and living in Europe. And again, when I say environmental difference, what I mean is the selective pressures in terms of IQ. And we can actually get at this somewhat empirically. So this is from a paper which looked at the difference in fertility between high-class and low-class individuals, defined in terms of income and occupation and education. And what we see looking at the top set of rows is that in Europe and North America, before the year 1750, high-class individuals had 35.8% more kids than low-class individuals did. But by the 1750 to 1899 period, this had changed such that high-class individuals had about 8% fewer kids. And this situation basically just got worse until about the mid-20th century, at which point it starts to turn around a little bit. Now, looking at data that comes from basically not Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, we see that in the 1750 to 1899 period, high-class individuals had 40% more kids than did low-class individuals, suggesting that during this period there was probably a eugenic effect for intelligence. And I say that because today we know that not only is IQ positively correlated with class, but moreover that genotypic IQ is correlated with class. That is, these sort of polygenic scores that I was talking about before. You can measure them in kids and see that people from high-class backgrounds tend to have higher polygenic IQ scores. If that was going on in the past, then what we would see is that in 1750 to 1899, there is a stronger eugenic trend outside of basically Europe than there is within Europe. Now, in the 1925 to 1949 period, on the other hand, there is a stronger dysgenic trend outside of Europe than there is within Europe. And in the 1975 to 2006 period, there is a much stronger dysgenic trend outside of Europe than within Europe. And so the point of this is just that historically, so far as we can tell, it does not look like there has been equal pressure in Europe and outside of Europe for intelligence in terms of fertility. This relationship seems to vary by region, and sometimes it varies in a way that favored Europe, and sometimes it varies in a way that favors not Europe. And I'm going to say that what I think is more likely, given the sensitivity of evolution as manifested in the Breeder's equation that we previously viewed, and the fact that that equation suggests that it could easily happen, that huge differences of many standard deviations would be produced. What I think is actually likely going on is that evolution has gone back and forth in both groups a lot over the course of history. But there's nothing in this data which suggests to me that somehow the relationship between fertility and intelligence is going to be the same consistently throughout history in these two groups. Now, I've talked a lot about the selection differential. It's just worth noting in passing that twin studies and the like show that IQ is heritable in blacks and whites. So here we see an analysis of 7 studies showing that about 52% of the variation in IQ is explainable by genes in both the white and black populations. If these studies had been restricted to only age groups of like full adults, that number would have been a little higher. Now, Mitchell also writes, the result is that any population at any time will carry a varied bunch of mutations that affect intelligence, and these will differ between populations, clans, families, and individuals. This constant churn of genetic variation works against any long-term rise or fall in intelligence. Well, turn to the recent paper, Holocene Selection for Variants Associated with General Cognitive Ability Comparing Ancient and Modern Genomes. And what's going on here, essentially, is that ancient genomes found and dug up by archaeologists and the like, we can take those and look at how they score on modern genetic tests for the genes of intelligence. And what we see is that throughout history, there is a correlation between polygenic score and the year in which an individual lived of 0.22, suggesting that over the last few thousand years, Eurasian populations, and this is a specifically Eurasian sample, has increased in genotypic intelligence. And this was found using 3 different polygenic scores for intelligence, one involving 11 SNPs, one involving 9 SNPs, and one involving 130 SNPs. So that I think actually the evidence that we have that's available, both in terms of the pattern of the association between fertility and class in Eurasia prior to the year 1750, and in terms of the changes historically in polygenic IQ score, both suggest, so the sort of proxy observation and the genetic analysis both suggest that genotypic IQ has probably been rising in Eurasia over the long run, contrary to what Mitchell seems to claim. Now, before leaving this altogether, I want to review just a few other things, sort of research that's come out in the last 5 years or so on this topic. Some of the sort of stuff that I think maybe would be appearing in The Guardian if they had a more fair to the hereditarian side of things, sort of people writing these articles. So for one thing, there's this paper from 2016 called The Relationship Between Cross-National Genetic Differences and IQ Differences. Here, 4 different measures of genetic difference were calculated between tons of different pairs of countries. And what we see is a positive relationship between the distance in IQ of a country and the genetic distance between a given pair of countries. This correlation overall is 0.37, and it reduces to 0.22 when you control for differences in the Human Development Index. You also have the paper Haplogroups as Evolutionary Markers of Cognitive Ability. Came out in 2012, and it finds that haplogroups, which is a sort of genetic marker, predicts the cognitive ability of countries, and that it does so partly directly and partly indirectly through its effect on health, education, and wealth, and the like. And finally, you have this paper, Biogeographic Ancestry and Socioeconomic Outcomes in the Americas, a meta-analysis, in which it's found that within non-white populations, European genetic admixture positively correlates with socioeconomic status, correlation of 0.18, and both Amerindian and African admixture were negatively associated with socioeconomic status, correlations of negative 0.14 and negative 0.11. In a similar paper by some of the same authors, Admixtures in the America, Regional and National Differences. It reads, we conducted novel analyses regarding the association between regional and national European, African, and Amerindian racial ancestry, cognitive ability, and socioeconomic outcomes across 6 datasets. States of Mexico, states of the United States, states of Brazil, departments of Colombia, sovereign nations, and all units together. We find that European ancestry is consistently and usually strongly correlated with cognitive ability and socioeconomic outcomes. In most cases, including another ancestry component in addition to European ancestry did not increase predictive power. What this means is that if you already know how European a region is, knowing how African or how Amerindian it is isn't going to help you predict its IQ. Now it goes on, the association between European ancestry and outcomes at the national level was robust. 2 controls for various natural environmental factors. It also says that genetic distance did not have predictive power independent of European ancestry, which means that the more genetically distant 2 populations are does not predict how different they are in IQ once you control for how white they are. Finally, it says, we failed to find any evidence of international colorism or culturalism, that is, neither skin reflectance nor self-reported racial ethnicity showed incremental predictive validity once genome ancestry had been taken into account. So in other words, once you looked at someone's genome, how they personally identified or how dark their skin was did not help you predict their IQ at all. So those are some recent advances in the last couple years of this sort of IQ research that I think is interesting. And overall, I think that with all due respect, the sort of picture of the genetics of intelligence that is presented in the paper in The Guardian is just not accurate. It just doesn't map on well to what we seem to know about this stuff. So, there you go.